My Best Friends Live in the Woods. The Adventures of Albert by Michelle Mracek.
Chapter 38, Junior and Tulip. So who were you with last night? Albert was asking Jimmy Squirrel as the two walked down toward the stream. I saw you two eating at the table with your mom and sisters. Then later, when I was going to come over, you were both gone, Albert explained. Jimmy kicked the dirt and smiled shyly as he watched a puff of dirt rise. Yeah, well, who is she? Albert poked Jimmy in the arm, pushing him with a tease. Misty, Jimmy said, turning red. You are blushing, Albert taunted, smiling. Am not. Jimmy pushed back. Are too, Albert returned the push, and they both laughed. You looked all dapper in that bow tie, Albert continued. Dressing up to impress the little lady? Albert pushed Jimmy in the arm again. Yeah, well, so what? Jimmy laughed. So tell me everything, Albert said, eyes sparkling. Jimmy stopped walking and turned to face Albert. Misty is perfect, Jimmy said seriously. Oh, really? Albert raised an eyebrow. And how did you meet Miss Perfect? Albert asked, now really interested. Jimmy continued walking toward the stream, and Albert followed. They walked in silence till they reached the bank of the stream. Jimmy sat down on a boulder and dangled his feet in the flowing water. He was watching the green watergrass flow as the stream pushed its endless way past them. Then Jimmy took a deep breath. At first, I didn't pay her much attention, Jimmy started to explain, breaking the silence. She just kept showing up. But then a couple of days after the party at your house, she showed up again. Albert nodded and waited for Jimmy to continue. You had gotten promised, and honestly, I was jealous, Jimmy admitted. I wondered if I would ever see you again, Jimmy said. You do have a serious side, Albert said in wonder. It was the first time Jimmy had ever let Albert see this side of himself. Jimmy shot a smile and pushed Albert in the arm again. Oh yeah, he teased. Then he settled into watching the flow of the river grass. So what happened after the party? Albert coaxed him. So, she showed up, right? And says, oh, James, I always knew you were a hero. Jimmy squirmed uncomfortably. James? Albert laughed. She calls you James? Jimmy pushed Albert in the arm again. Yeah, so? He smiled. Oh, James, you're my hero, Albert teased in a girl's voice and pushed Jimmy back. Jimmy got serious and looked at Albert. It's pretty nice to be someone's hero, he said. Albert got quiet too and nodded. Yes, he agreed. It's pretty nice. They sat together in silence, listening to the gentle rush of the water and an occasional bird chirping overhead. The sun shone down and warmed their shoulders. So, where did you disappear to after dinner? Albert asked after a spell. Oh, just up the pine tree near the bonfire, Jimmy shrugged. It was warm there and we had a great overview of the party. And you could be alone, Albert grinned. So, do you think you will see her again? Albert asked. Jimmy took a deep breath and nodded. Albert nodded back. Want to swim? Albert asked, standing up. Sure, Jimmy said and splashed into the water. Ricky and Nicholas showed up and splashed in. We smell like smoke, Ricky announced, sniffing his arm and frowning. You guys did a great job with the fire, Albert smiled at his brothers. Thanks, they both said as they splashed about scrubbing their fur. So, who's Misty? Nicholas asked Jimmy and splashed him. How did you know her name? Jimmy asked, amazed. I asked your mom, Nicholas grinned. Yeah, and she was more than happy to fill us in, Ricky joined in. Oh, man, Jimmy twitched his tail. What else did she say? Wouldn't you like to know? Ricky teased, and the water fight began. The sparkling droplets flew, and the tadpoles darted for cover as the four boys tussled and laughed. They were lying on their backs, staring up at the trees, lazily drying off, when Clara came running up, all out of breath. Come quick, all of you, she shouted. The lazy mood was shattered as they sprang to their feet. Mrs. Beaver is in labor and Mother needs help, Clara shouted. Where is she? Albert took Clara's hands as she bent over, gasping to catch her breath. At the beaver pond, she managed between gulps of air. Mother needs a fire, she said, looking between Ricky and Nicholas, handing them a flintstone from her apron pocket. Now go, she shouted at them, waving her arms. Are you going to be okay? Albert said, searching Clara's face, red from the exercise. I'm fine. I'll catch up in a bit, she reassured him and sat on the riverbank to recover. This way, Albert led. It's a shortcut, he pointed, and the four raced off, leaving Clara to pant by the stream. Earlier at the cave, Abigail, too, was gasping for air. She had been visiting again with Mrs. Beaver when the labor pains had started and ran all the way home to fetch Mother Skunk. Thank goodness you went to visit. Mother Skunk had smiled at Abigail as she rushed around the kitchen, putting herbs and towels in a basket. I wouldn't want Mr. Beaver to have to leave her by herself to fetch help. Abigail nodded. I just knew I needed to be there this morning, Abigail agreed. My helping spirit told me to hurry there when I woke up this morning, she explained. Well, thank you for listening, Mother patted her daughter's head. What can I carry? Abigail asked as Mother moved toward the door. That basket, she pointed. Bluebell and Rosie, come with me. Clara, run and find Albert, Ricky, and Nicholas and send them to the beaver pond. Mother Skunk's mind was racing. Oh, I need a fire, she said, handing Clara a flintstone, and bowed her head. The girls walked over to her, and they all joined hands. Great Creator, protect my friend Mrs. Beaver and her babies, she prayed, and then they all said, Hear our prayers. Okay, off we go. Mother snapped back into action. Mother Skunk had been gathering her herbs for days, knowing the delivery was near. I just knew it would be soon, she was telling Bluebell as they rushed toward the beaver pond. Did you see? She ate 2 plates of food last night at the party. She was really packing it away, Bluebell laughed. I always ate everything in sight the night before the babies came, Mother smiled. As soon as the labor pains had begun, Mr. Beaver had hauled Mrs. Beaver on his back across the pond to the shore. Hold on tight, he had instructed her as he valiantly swam for all he was worth, barely keeping his head above the water. He had prepared a nesting bed of tall grass and moss for her and helped her lay down to rest. It'll be much easier for Mother Skunk to tend to you on the shore, he had explained, stroking her hand as she moaned. The next few hours were a blur. She became aware of a warm fire nearby and heard muffled conversations of Mother Skunk and Bluebell. At one point, she recognized Abigail and smiled up at her faintly. Mother Skunk had coaxed her to eat large quantities of wild lettuce, and the pain had eased. She remembered hearing Mother Skunk shouting, Push! You have to push! And then everything went black. She woke up in a daze, her eyes slowly blinking open. She's awake, she heard her husband's voice, and his smiling face came into focus. Well, hello there, Mama, he grinned. She looked back and forth between Mother Skunk and Mr. Beaver, both smiling down at her. Then Bluebell came over and handed a tiny bundle of squirming fur into her arms. "Your son is waiting for you to name him," she grinned. "And your daughter." Abigail smiled as she gently placed another tiny bundle at her side. Tears of joy streamed down her face. "Blessed be to the great Creator," she said in awe, pulling the blankets back to peek at the precious tiny faces. "You will be William Jr. after your father," she said to her son. Mr. Beaver was smiling from ear to ear. "Did you hear that?" he said to Mother Skunk and Bluebell, and then kissed his wife on the forehead. "But a daughter," she mused. "I never thought of a daughter's name. I just assumed I would have boys," she said with a far-off smile. "You don't have to decide right now," Mr. Beaver offered. "Just rest," he said, stroking her head. She smiled faintly and drifted off to sleep. "I wish my mother was here to greet her grandchildren," Mr. Beaver sighed. Mother Skunk nodded. "What was her name?" she asked him. Mr. Beaver's expression was far off in a distant memory. "Tulip," he announced. "Then perhaps her granddaughter should be named Tulip," she smiled. In her dreams, Mrs. Beaver felt herself drifting further and further away. She dreamt she had stepped into a small boat and began to drift downstream. She could see her husband and Mother Skunk standing on the shore, getting smaller and smaller as she floated away from them. She felt weightless, and as she floated, the stream of water turned into clouds. Farther and farther, the tiny boat carried her, and she had no strength to resist. Then she saw her own mother's face smiling down at her. "Are the babies born?" her mother asked. She nodded yes. "Good," her mother smiled. "The family will go on," she said, and her image turned into mist as she watched, drifting, drifting. Then she saw her mother-in-law. "I heard my granddaughter is named Tulip after me," she was saying to a shadowy figure to her right. She turned her head and saw Mrs. Beaver in a tiny boat. "You can't be here," she said sternly. "Go back and take care of my grandchildren," she scolded. "I'm too tired." Mrs. Beaver heard her own voice as if far away. "Nonsense," her mother-in-law scolded. "Turn that boat around and go home," she ordered. When she opened her eyes, Albert was sitting by her side, holding her hand. It was dark, and a nice warm fire was softly crackling. She was slowly aware of her husband, Mother Skunk, and Mrs. Badger sleeping nearby. Albert nudged Mr. Beaver. "She's awake," he whispered. Mr. Beaver suddenly processed what Albert had said and struggled to sit up and come to her side. Albert stepped away as he sat beside her. "Welcome back." He smiled at her and kissed her forehead. What time is it?" She looked up at the stars with confusion. "Never mind," he whispered. "We thought you had left us," he said, a tear rolling down his cheek. She reached up and wiped away the tear. "I did," she said with a faint smile. "Your mother sent me back," she said with a heavy sigh. "I hear our daughter's name is Tulip." She smiled at him. His eyes grew wide. "How did you know?" he asked in wonder. "She told me," she said, her eyes closing again. "Just rest," he said, patting her hand. "I'll take the next watch," he told Albert. Albert nodded and lay down to try to get some sleep. The sun was high when next she opened her eyes. The fire was out, and she could hear Mrs. Badger saying, "That's right, Tulip. Eat your breakfast. Junior has already finished and is napping." Mother Skunk came into view. She lifted her head and put a cup to her lips. "Sip some tea," she encouraged. The cool mint tasted wonderful, and she was suddenly hungry. "Is there any toast?" Mrs. Beaver asked. "Bluebell, fetch my basket, please," Mother Skunk called over. "Yes, actually there is," she smiled at her friend. As the days passed, Mrs. Beaver's strength returned. Tulip and Junior were being fed by Mrs. Badger. She had been meaning to wean her triplets and still had plenty of milk. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Mrs. Rabbit came to visit with Gabby and George, and Mr. Badger joined his wife frequently to pay a visit. The two men were busy building the addition onto the Badger den and would often excuse themselves from the ladies to go off to work. Occasionally, they would take Albert, Ricky, and Nicholas along for helping hands. Did you really leave in a boat?" Mrs. Rabbit was asking, her nose twitching with the excitement of the story. Mrs. Beaver nodded. "Yes, I really did," she nodded. "I talked to my mother and to my mother-in-law." She related her strange dream. "It was my mother-in-law that sent me back," she said and smiled. "She was always bossy," she grinned. "Well, good thing," Mrs. Rabbit said, patting Mrs. Beaver's hand. "When the babies are bigger, can I babysit them?" Gabby asked. "Yes, of course," Mrs. Beaver said, smiling. Then one afternoon, Jimmy Squirrel came by to visit with Misty on his arm. "This is Misty," he introduced her, all smiles. "We came to see how you are doing," Misty said warmly. "Do you need more firewood?" Jimmy asked most sincerely. "Firewood?" Mrs. Beaver said, confused. "Yeah, I was bringing Ricky and Nicholas firewood for 3 days," Jimmy explained. "It's true," Mr. Beaver said, patting Jimmy on the back. "He must have run back and forth 1,000 times," he explained to his wife. 3 days? I'm so confused. Mrs. Beaver looked back and forth between Jimmy and her husband. "You were sleeping for 3 days after the babies arrived. We had to keep you warm around the clock," Jimmy explained. "That's why we sent for Mrs. Badger. The babies were hungry and you were in no condition to feed them," her husband added. 3 days? Mrs. Beaver was shocked. "It only seemed like a minute or two," she said, shaking her head. "Well, the important thing is you're feeling better now, and soon you will be up and playing with your children," Misty said, smiling at her. "They are adorable." Mrs. Badger walked up holding a bundle of fur in a pink blanket. "Tulip is sleeping. I just fed her. She's milk drunk," she laughed. "I thought you might like to hold her," she said. "Yes, thank you." Mrs. Beaver cradled her tiny daughter in her arms and started to cry. "I'm sorry I left you for 3 days," she sobbed. "Mama will never leave you again," she promised and kissed her baby. Mrs. Badger teared up, seeing her friend's distress, and sat down beside her. She leaned over and gave her a hug. Your Auntie Bee will be right here too.
Chapter 38, Junior and Tulip. Discussion and questions. Trust and compassion. Albert and Jimmy have a typical tease and tussle relationship often seen between boys. It's when Jimmy decides to trust Albert with his true, deeper feelings that their relationship matures. Question 1. Are there people in your life you trust enough to share your true, deeper feelings? Question 2. When you allow yourself to be vulnerable, how does this change the relationship? When Mrs. Badger goes into labor, we see many forest folk devoting their full measure of compassion to help her. It's probable that without their unwavering support and care, she would not have survived. Question 3. Have you ever been in the compassionate care of another? Question 4. If necessary, would you be willing to devote your full measure of compassion to care for others in a crisis? Mrs. Beaver returns to consciousness, knowing her daughter's name. She believes her spirit left and returned to her body. Question 5. Do you see yourself as a spirit having an experience in a body for this lifetime? Question 6. Do you believe your spirit continues to exist after it separates from this bio-machine we call a body?
I am the composer and performer for all the music in this video. Both audio recordings and the printed scores are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. I will provide the link below. The painted illustrations are also my creation. Prints are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. This is a novel. The chapters are meant to be heard in the order in which they were written. And while each chapter can stand alone, they do build as new characters are introduced and past events are referred to. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The chapters are numbered, so if you're just joining us, be sure to go back and watch from Chapter 1.
In a dream, in a trance, my spirit flies to the pink horizon of the forest, where fairies say, come and play, and the animals say, there's a better way, an enchanted land of love.